My name is Eva Carr. This is my husband, Chris. We are excited to spend a few minutes with you these next 6 weeks to discuss neighboring and hospitality. We're going to talk about the biblical framework for this and really the call in our lives to live this way. And then whenever possible, we're going to share some additional resources that will help and have really been a help to the both of us. We'll give you loads and loads of practical advice and tips on how to live that way. But first, we have to talk about the basis for loving our neighbor. Our love for others comes from our love for God. We replicate the love that we've experienced from Him. God is the source of our love for others. We have inherent value, as we all know, as an image bearer of God. Nothing removes the right to dignity and respect. And we are called to love others despite their unloveliness, just like God did for us.
So as we begin this discussion of neighboring and hospitality, we need to start with a biblical foundation. And there are many places that we can go in the scriptures, a number of which we will look at over the course of these 6 weeks. But we really need to start with Matthew chapter 22, where Jesus has an interaction with a lawyer, where this lawyer asks him, what is the greatest commandment in all of the law? And Jesus responds to the lawyer, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And all of the law of the prophets, Jesus says, can be summed up in these two commandments. So love God and love your neighbor. Now, in a parallel passage in Luke chapter 10, after Jesus answers this question, he is asked in response, well, then who is my neighbor? The person asking this question is trying to justify himself, trying to limit the scope of who he's called to love. And so in response to this, Jesus tells one of his most famous parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I'm not going to walk through the whole parable with you here. You probably are relatively familiar with it, but just to kind of review for you, there's a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And on the way, he's attacked by some robbers, and they beat him, take all that he has, and they leave him for dead. And as he's lying there are two religious men who pass by, one a priest and one a Levite. And they see him lying there on the side of the road, and they just pass by without doing anything. Well, then there's a third man who passes by, and this man is a Samaritan. Now, the significance of that is that Samaritans and Jews were mortal enemies. They hated one another. They had nothing to do with one another. And yet it is this Samaritan who stops and he cares for this man who has been hurt and who is lying there dying. And so he binds up the man's wounds, he puts him on his donkey, he takes him to an inn where he can be cared for, and he provides all of the money that is needed for that man to get well and to get back on his feet. And so as Jesus ends this parable, he asks this question. He says, who of these three was this man's neighbor? And of course, the response is the man who showed him mercy, the man who cared for him. And in saying this, what Jesus is trying to drive home is that our neighbor is anyone who is in need. Our neighbor is anyone who needs care. It's not just the people who live next to us. It's not just the people who we interact with, not just our friends, not just the people who we go to church with. It's really anyone, and everyone is our neighbor. And so as we dive into this and we think about this, we shouldn't limit this idea of neighboring and hospitality simply to the people that might be comfortable for us to love on and to care for, but it really should be open to everyone. Now, there's one more thing I want to add here. We're truly going to understand and apply what Jesus is telling us in this parable of the Great Samaritan. And that is the fact that Jesus really wants us to see that before we can truly neighbor, we must realize that we need to be neighbored. In other words, Jesus wants us to see that in that parable of the Good Samaritan, we aren't the Samaritan, we aren't the priest or the Levite, or at least we're not first and foremost any of those three men, but rather we are the man who has been injured. We are the man who needs to be cared for. We're the man who has been left for dead. And that Jesus has come in order to neighbor us, in order to care for us, in order to meet our needs, in order to provide everything that we need to get healthy. And it's when we understand that Jesus has first neighbored us, that we understand that first God has loved us, that now in response, we can not only love him, but we can love our neighbors. We can love everyone that the Lord would bring us in contact with, and especially those who need to be cared for. They need to experience hospitality, and ultimately, they need the gospel.
Now for some of those practical thoughts and maybe helpful advice that I mentioned earlier. Loving our neighbors might look like meeting physical needs. It might look like meeting emotional needs. It doesn't mean we meet every single need that we see. We would not want to, of course, meet a need that would enable some sort of destructive lifestyle. But basic care of others is the minimum. We may even need to earn an audience with people that we are trying to show hospitality to. We might need to do that just so that they'll hear us out. We need to build relationship capital first. Don't make people feel like projects. I know that that is a real temptation because in your mind, in your heart, you really want to help this certain person or draw this certain person to Christ, but you need to build relationship and not have them on your to-do list. I think that's why it's essential to see their image-bearing value and to love them no matter how they respond to your efforts and to the gospel. We need to fight the temptation to avoid people that are different than us. In my childhood home, we lived next door to some friendly unbelievers. And while there was the occasional borrowing of the lawnmower or things like that, we never even shared a meal with that family. I was taught that we weren't supposed to spend quality time with people that didn't believe the same things that we did. But sometimes we can love our neighbors by simply being a friend and being willing to invite them into your space. It needs to be genuine love, no conditions, no terms. We need to just meet people where they are. Jesus was the master at getting to the heart of people. He made them recognize their sin and their need for a savior. But I think it's important to remember that he did not win over every single person that he came in contact with. And it's going to take us much, much longer than Jesus. The Apostle Paul said it very well that it takes many people to reach some. Some will plant, some will water, but God will bring the growth. We are just called to be faithful.